Hello, history scholars. Mrs. Olson here. This is part 2 of the Civil War begins. So let's start where we left off. All right. So the next note, the title of the slide is Fort Sumter Falls. Okay. Now, Fort Sumter was one of the few federal military bases that the South had not seized, and seize means to take. Okay. Seize means to take. So, President Lincoln in 1861, he announced that he was going to send supplies to Fort Sumter. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, because Fort Sumter is located in South Carolina. Now, think back to the states that had seceded from the Union, okay? Was South Carolina one of them? If you said yes, you are paying attention. Good job. So that's one of the southern states that had seceded. It seemed unacceptable to have the US military send supplies there. Jefferson Davis demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter because it was in South Carolina. Now, the US Army did not do that, so Confederate forces bombarded it for 33 hours on 2 days in the month of April. Now, no one was killed, but it was considered the start of the Civil War. Okay, so this might be somewhere in your notes that you put a star by this note. You do something to it, underline the dates. Underline the start of the Civil War so that you know that this was the battle that kick-started, if you will, the start of the Civil War. Okay? All right, so let's look at a couple of photographs. Well, this is a photograph. This is a painting of Fort Sumter in 1861. So that you can see that it is a rather large structure. This was it, obviously, before it got bombed. This is a rendition of that, an artist's idea of what happened or what it looked like for those 33 hours of bombardment. And then today, if you are a traveler, if you are out sightseeing, you can actually visit Fort Sumter. Okay, so there it is. You can see what shape they built it into. This is obviously new. This is the ferry dock that takes you there so that you can go walk around and visit Fort Sumter. Okay. The next slide reads, the title of it is Hanging On to Border States. So Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days. Okay. Now, you might not think this is such a big deal, but what he's doing is he's calling up people to serve, and it is creating a crisis in what is considered the Upper South. I'll show you a map in just a second, okay? Now, the Upper South is considered still the South, but these are states that had not broken away from the North. These are people that do not want to fight against their brothers, against their fellow Southerners, just because they are still part of the North. Okay? Now it says between April and June of 1861, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, they also leave the North. Okay? Now, the next note reads that Lincoln could not afford to lose slave-holding border states as well. So let's give you the list of those slave-holding border states. They are Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maryland. Now, I'm going to show you a map in just a second so that we can get our eyes on the locations of these states. But before we go there, I want to give you a little fact about these states that also left in the middle of 1861. Okay, when all of these states left, the Confederacy pulls a pretty bold move by putting the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia. Do you know where that is? It's across the Potomac River, and Washington, D.C., which is the nation's capital, lies right on the other side. Okay, so let's demonstrate in images so we can see this. So here we go. Here are the upper southern states that seceded between April and June of 1861. All right. And these are the other upper southern states that did not secede that Lincoln was worried about. Okay. Now I'm going to stay on this one for just a second. You can read seceded before Fort Sumter, that's the blue. Purple, seceded after Fort Sumter. And then the orangey color is border states that did not secede. The next one is so that you can see where Richmond, Virginia, this is the Confederate capital, is in relation to Washington, D.C. So the Potomac River is this one right here. And you could probably see on a clear day all the way across to Washington, D.C. Maybe not, but it's in close proximity. So that's the gutsy move that the Confederates did, was to put Richmond virtually in the sight line of Washington, D.C. Okay, more information of hanging on to border states. So Lincoln imposes something called martial law in Baltimore. Martial law means military rule. Can you imagine martial law being imposed in your town? Lincoln did this because angry mobs had attacked federal troops. Anyone supporting secession could be arrested and held without trial, which the Constitution, you've learned this, which the Constitution protects. Okay, so I want you to remember that fact. So fighting erupts in Kentucky and Missouri. But in the end, Kentucky and Missouri, they stay in the North or in the Union. These are examples of how the Civil War shattered old loyalties and made enemies of former friends. All right, so let's look at another map just so that we can get our brains around where these places are located. Here's Kentucky, here's Missouri. This is where the mobs broke out and attacked federal troops, and where President Lincoln imposed martial law, right? So that's military rule, is think of it as a police state, if you will, in these two states. Okay. The opposing sides, here we go. Robert E. Lee. Has anybody ever heard of Robert E. Lee? If you're from the South, if you ever traveled the South, you might see that his name is kind of everywhere. Now, Robert E. Lee was offered to command Union troops, so these are Northern troops, but he resigned to join the Confederacy. Okay, now I'm actually going to back that up for just a moment to tell you a little something about Robert E. Lee. He was actually from the state of Virginia, and he spoke out against secession. He did not want Virginia to break away. He also, this is an important one to understand, folks, he also considered slavery a moral and political evil, but he just couldn't fight against his home state of Virginia, which is why he resigned with the Union and he joined the Confederacy. Okay, this note is important. It's actually going to help you answer a question on your assignment. There were 8 military colleges in the United States. 7 of these 8 military colleges were located in the South. Now, this gives the South an advantage because of a strong military tradition. These colleges provided the South with a large number of trained officers to lead its army. Okay, what did the North have? Well, the North had a strong naval tradition. More than 3/4 of U.S. naval officers came from the North. Not only was the North supplied by the U.S. Navy, but most of America's merchant ships were located in the North. This gave the North a large pool of trained sailors. All right, so give a face with a name. This is Robert E. Lee. You've got it. All right, this is the end of part 2 of The Civil War Begins.